Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm your host, Rick Bennett. Please consider donating or purchasing a transcript by going to our website, gospeltangents.com/shop. You'll help support other documentaries and podcasts such as this. You've probably heard lots of ghost stories, Ouija boards, and other supernatural phenomenon. I was surprised to hear Dr. Richard Bennett, a BYU professor of church history, tell us that spiritualism, the idea of communing with the dead, may have had an impact on the LDS endowment. Let's listen into our conversation. You mentioned also something about the endowments for the dead were a reaction to some other things going on in Salt Lake. Could you talk about that?
You're talking about spiritualism?
Yes.
Well, that's only one factor, but it is a factor. Spiritualism, the practice of communing with the dead, adulterated today by Ouija boards and things like this, and telekinesis and paranormal. But spiritualism is well known in American history as flowering after the Civil War, with so many dead and lost, and the great desire of many families to know what happened to their sons or their fathers or their brothers, and how did it happen, and this great desire for resolution, which war does not allow for in many cases, led to many people seeking the dead through spiritualism, which is knocking on tables, spiritual writing from the other side, through seances and what have you. This really kind of flowered in America after the Civil War, and it was a factor in the rise of the Godbyite movement. William S. Godby and some of his intellectual friends from England who broke with Brigham Young over his economic policies, not trading with Eastern merchants and what have you. Brigham Young was very much for, we'll make it ourselves. We'll be self-sustaining. We don't need to deal with the Eastern merchants. All of which flowers after the coming of the railroad. All this new merchandise and the economics. Economics, is Leonard Arrington in his great book, Great Basin Kingdom, is a factor in a lot of our doctrines, a lot of our organizations. And so the Godbyite movement is an economic negative reaction to Brigham Young. But they have to have a theological underpinning to it, and they fasten on spiritualism. And Amos Lyman, a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, is converted to them and becomes quite an advocate of spiritualism, which really isn't a religion at all. It doesn't believe in the atonement of Christ or anything like that. But it does believe in communing with the dead. In the 1870s, there's a lot of comment by general authorities, leaders of the church, particularly Orson Pratt, about that this is a counterfeit. But it has its place. We understand why people are seeking the dead. Was that a factor in the beginning of endowments for the dead in the church in 1877? I claim that it may have been one of the factors to begin to address how we really believe about this. There is redemption for the dead, but it's not that way. It's another way. So was it a factor? I argue that it probably was one of the factors. The coming of the railroad certainly was a factor. In the re-establishment of the Relief Society in 1867, all the auxiliaries, we needed to have a response to all these new philosophies that are coming down the track. The new religions. Was the building of the St. George Temple in 1877 somewhat a response to that? Maybe. But I think it's a reclamation of much of what we had done in Nauvoo and all the way back to Kirtland. It's a progression of our theological understanding of temple work. If you're going to have baptisms for the dead, why wouldn't we have endowments for the dead? It's a logical progression in my mind. But it didn't come immediately to the saints. It took a while for that to get there.
Interesting. So was William Godby, was he ever Mormon?
Oh yeah, he was a very, very strong Latter-day Saint. There was a coterie, a cluster of intellectuals. Harrison was another one. Trying to think of all the other ones. There were a small number of astute intellectual Latter-day Saints who broke with Brigham Young in the 1870s, who thought they knew the gospel a little bit better than Brigham Young did. But they thought that they knew economics better than Brigham Young did, and they broke over the church with that. The Salt Lake Tribune starts with the God-Beite movement, which was very negative, of course, against the church. It still tends to be a little bit on that side, but that's its history.
Oh, that's interesting. All right, so I guess 1893, Wilford Woodruff. Is that one of those revelations that we need to reclaim, as far as getting rid of the law of adoption and now you're just sealed to your family? As far back as it concerns?
I think that's the doctrine of readjustments. There's reclamation and adjustments, a coming of an understanding. Oh, this is what this means. Okay, we'll do that.
So I would just like a new edition where we've got that revelation in there. I'd love to see that one.
I think it goes back to our 8th article of faith. We believe that all that God has revealed. Now we have to understand that a little better. All that He is revealing and all that He will yet reveal. It's a radical theology.
Yeah.
Revelation could mean radical change. And the Manifesto, for instance, of 1890, ending plural marriage, is a radical thing.
That's actually where I wanted to go next. So
maybe revolutionary would be a better term, but you know what I mean. It was not a little thing.
Yeah. So, because that was a big part. I know you gave a presentation at the Sons of Utah Pioneers a while back, and that was one of the things that struck me was you said, in Wilford Woodruff's mind, there was all these polygamy prosecutions, and it was more important to save the temples, because at that time, what was going on there that we were worried about losing all the temples?
Well, we were losing the temples over this fight with the United States government on plural marriage, because the church wasn't going to give that up. John Taylor dies in hiding in defense of it. There's no question that plural marriage was a very, very major commitment of the church. And it defined us, and we were commanded to live it. A lot of saints today think, oh, this is just, we're going to stop this. This was a huge deal. Here, I'll read from the official declaration, which is the footnotes to section 2, declaration number 1. Wilford Woodruff says, and I've got other evidences of this in times, other places he said, the question is this: which is the wisest course for the saints to pursue, Latter-day Saints to pursue? To continue to attempt to practice plural marriage with the laws of the nation against it, and the opposition of 60 million people, and at the cost of the convocation loss of all the temples, and stopping all of the ordinances therein, including endowments for the dead now, both for the living and the dead? Or, after doing and suffering what we have through our adherence to this principle, cease the practice and submit to the law? What's the wisest course? And the whole question of how Wilford Woodruff reached the conclusion long before this, long before the fight over the United States government and the Evans-Tucker Act and the confiscation of our properties. Well, the wisest course is what we've been doing since Nauvoo, since baptism for the dead. And now endowments for the living in Nauvoo, and now endowments for the dead in St. George. Are we going to give up all this for what you would have to say in his mind was a temporary subset of the law of eternal marriage? If I will command, I will, says the Lord, on plural marriage. If I do command, in other words, it's not a permanent law. The Book of Mormon makes that very clear. Wilford Woodruff understood that it has its place at a certain time, but are we going to give up the eternal doctrine of redemption for the dead for a temporary subset of eternal marriage? Which is the wisest course? Was he selling down river Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor? Not in his mind. He had received clear revelation that how can we hold on to what they taught and still make a major change? And tremendously courageous to do what he did. And it took a man like Wilford Woodruff because he was bathed in the water of plural marriage, in that sense that he had 5 wives. He'd suffered with all the rest of them to live it day by day, and he wasn't going to give that up for any little thing, you know. But he says he received revelation from the Lord saying, time is up on this one, but redemption for the dead is an eternal law. Temple work is an eternal thing. Plural marriage is a temporary subset of an eternal marriage law, right? Mm-hmm. Very, very important, though. We gave our lives for it, went to prison for it, we fought everything for it. It was a major junction in the history of the church. But did we sell our soul? Did we sell them down the river? Not in Wilford Woodruff's mind. Because even in Brigham Young's mind, the full understanding of temple work hadn't developed. Even in Joseph's own mind, it was a line upon line thing. So this is where this has now come. We were doing all these millions of ordinances. Are we going to give all this up for this? What's the wisest course?
Fascinating. So
that's the title of the book I'm doing. Hopefully we'll be done soon.
Well, I will definitely help you sell that book. So it sounds very interesting.
But in a very real sense, let me just say this last thing. Mm-hmm. Our surrender of plural marriage was in many ways our greatest affidavit to the significance of temple work. Because what you surrender for something else is a testimony of how that something else is so important. And that's how we can reclaim and should understand plural marriage. It was what the Lord asked us to do for that period of time, and a great sacrifice to do it, and to give that up after all that we had gone to prison for is the greatest statement of how significant temple work has become.
Well, and a lot of people had a problem with that because they didn't believe, they believed that plural marriage was more important.
A small number. I think you have to see it. Despite all the problems that we had in surrendering plural marriage, and we did, we had to come up with another manifesto in 1904. And there were break-offs down the road over this whole thing. But it's always a very small number who claim that. The great majority of the church recognized, the time has come, let's move on.
Cool. So, looks like 1893, 1894, we've changed from the law of adoption to kind of what we have now.
Actually, it was scaling down long before that. I've gone through all these records. I've seen them. The number of adoptions was declining all through the 70s and 80s. It was not a big thing in the 1890s. It was the death knell in 1893. But the rush was now to family work through the 80s and early 90s. It's hardly even understood amongst many of the church members at that time.
Well, yeah. So my question was, to me, that was pretty big. I mean, even if it was declining, that was kind of a big.
Oh, it was. It was the beginning of the Genealogical Society.
Right.
The whole work of doing work for the dead. Another reason, by the way, for the demise of the law of adoption and the rise of endowments for the dead and everything else was the growth in genealogical societies and genealogical research worldwide. You really have to study that phenomenon about how genealogy becomes a major hobby of a lot of people, and the development of societies worldwide in the 1880s, 1890s. And it has something to do with the wars, but there's this same thing going on worldwide about reclamation of family histories and the availability of records. We didn't have the records that we wanted to have in the 60s and 70s. It's only as with the railroad allowing for the quicker movement of records and postage and people being able to get their records where it is an impetus for this. So there are a lot of things happening outside of just Mormonism which are factors in all of this equation. Major things.
I hope you enjoyed our discussion about spiritualism in the Manifesto. In our next discussion with Dr. Bennett, we'll finish up and we'll talk about changes in the temples from 1890 to present.
After 1900 and the beginning of an understanding that we should stay where we are and gather to the local units and gather in your own nations, you begin to see temples now moving out from Utah. And I think the first major expression of that would be the Cardston Temple.
Click here to subscribe, click here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some other videos that we've done here on YouTube. We hope you'll use this as a valuable resource to learn more about Mormon history.